Back in 1941, railroads swung for the fences and built a steam locomotive so massive it earned the name Big Boy. It pulled freight through grades others feared, a symbol of brute confidence at a turning point in history. Then the clock moved fast. Within 2 decades, diesel power swept in and steam faded from the main line. The biggest engine on Earth became a museum piece, its last run written off as fantasy. Years later in Nebraska, modern diesel stalled and the old giant rolled again, towing more than 10 engines to safety. Why did a machine declared obsolete answer the call? And what does that say about progress when pressure hits? Diesel locomotives rewrote the rules of railroading with a speed that caught many veterans off guard. Crews who had spent decades living by the rhythms of steam felt the shift the moment they stepped into a diesel cab. There was no long wait for pressure to rise, and no careful tending of fire and water through the night. A turn of a key brought the engine to life, ready to move freight within minutes. Jobs that once demanded a full team now rested on the shoulders of a much smaller crew. The engineer and firemen who had worked alongside hostlers, boilermakers, and roundhouse staff suddenly found themselves part of a lean operation built around efficiency rather than ritual. The change was not gradual. It was immediate and decisive, and railroads embraced it with both hands. Diesels introduced a flexibility steam could never match. Multiple units could be linked together and controlled from a single cab, allowing one crew to command the power of 4 or 5 locomotives at once. This system, known as multiple unit control, gave dispatchers and managers a new level of freedom. Power could be added or removed depending on the load without assigning extra crews or rearranging schedules. The old practice of double-heading steam locomotives, each engine carrying its own crew, began to disappear. Railroads saw the advantage quickly. Trains grew longer and heavier, yet the manpower required to move them shrank. What happened in the cab reflected a much larger shift across the entire network. Behind the scenes, the savings multiplied. Steam power depended on an enormous support system that stretched across the continent. Coaling towers stood like monuments along the main lines. Water tanks appeared every 100 miles, placed with precision to keep boilers fed. Roundhouses buzzed day and night as machinists inspected bearings, replaced tubes, and adjusted valves. Every mile traveled added hours of maintenance. On average, a steam locomotive demanded 3 hours of shop work for every hour it spent on the road. Diesels broke that equation apart. They could run farther between servicing, required far less daily attention, and relied on standardized components that could be replaced quickly. Railroads that once employed thousands to keep steam fleets alive discovered they could move more freight with a fraction of the workforce. The numbers left little room for debate. Water stops vanished from schedules. Fueling became faster and more predictable. Infrastructure that had defined railroading for generations began to fade from the landscape. Coaling towers were dismantled, water tanks rusted away or were torn down, entire roundhouses closed their doors. In boardrooms, executives saw more than a new locomotive design. They saw a new philosophy built around speed, reliability, and lower costs. For massive steam locomotives designed for mountain grades and endless coal, the future narrowed quickly. Engines like the Big Boy had been built for a world that no longer existed. The final chapter of steam on Union Pacific's main line arrived without ceremony. During the summer of 1959, the remaining giants completed their runs with little fanfare. Shortly after midnight on July 21st, one of the Big Boys finished its last revenue trip, pushing freight across the high plains one final time. There were no speeches and no crowds, only a few railroaders standing nearby as a legend rolled into the yard and shut down. Within 2 years, all 25 Big Boys were retired. Their frames, once essential to moving heavy tonnage over mountain passes, sat silent on sidings and inside roundhouses from Wyoming to California. Some met the torch and were cut apart for scrap. Others were spared and placed on display, preserved as reminders of an era that had ended. Number 4014 reached the end of its working life on December 7th, 1961. After more than 1,000,000 miles of service, it was officially withdrawn. Union Pacific arranged for the locomotive to be donated to the Rail Giants Train Museum in Pomona, California. The move west lacked celebration. It was a careful and deliberate journey across deserts and cities, ending quietly at the edge of a fairground. There, the locomotive was positioned on a short stretch of track and left to rest. The firebox went cold. The massive running gear stopped turning. Fresh paint covered decades of wear, and a bronze plaque recorded the date of retirement. Visitors climbed into the cab and wrapped their hands around the throttle, imagining the weight and power once commanded from that seat. The engine itself remained still, preserved but dormant. As decades passed, the world around 4014 changed. Diesel locomotives grew more powerful and efficient. Trains became longer, crews became smaller, and the remnants of steam-era infrastructure disappeared almost completely. Children encountered Big Boy as a story told by parents or as a static exhibit behind a fence. The thought of returning such a machine to operation felt unrealistic, more fantasy than plan. For nearly half a century, 4014 stood as an artifact rather than a working locomotive. The age of giants seemed firmly locked in the past. That assumption shattered in December 2012 when Union Pacific announced plans to restore a Big Boy to operating condition. The news rippled through the rail preservation community with a mix of excitement and disbelief. For those closest to 4014, the announcement triggered months of meetings, paperwork, and careful discussion. The Rail Giants Train Museum had cared for the locomotive since 1962. Volunteers had protected it from rust and vandalism, spending weekends oiling bearings and inspecting components even when visitor numbers were low. Many saw themselves as guardians of history rather than owners. Letting the locomotive leave was not an easy decision. Union Pacific representatives arrived in the summer of 2013, carrying original blueprints and a detailed restoration plan. Museum board members studied every proposal, balancing the opportunity to see the engine run again against the loss of their most famous exhibit. On July 23, 2013, a decision was reached. Custody would be transferred back to Union Pacific with a binding agreement that the locomotive would be restored, preserved, and shared with the public. Ownership formally returned to the railroad that had built it, along with a promise that 4014 would never be scrapped or abandoned. With legal hurdles cleared, preparations for the move began. Mechanics inspected journal boxes, measured clearances, and planned how to guide a 1.2 million pound locomotive out of a fairground and onto the national rail network. Decades of careful stewardship showed their value. The locomotive remained in remarkable condition. As paperwork concluded, 4014 stood ready to leave Pomona. No longer an exhibit, but a candidate for rebirth. At sunrise on January 26, 2014, Union Pacific crews assembled at the Los Angeles County Fairgrounds. The task ahead tested planning and patience. The Big Boy 4014 stretched 132 feet from coupler to coupler and weighed nearly 1.2 million pounds. 4 diesel locomotives waited nearby to haul the giant more than 1,300 miles to Cheyenne, Wyoming. Every curve, crossing, and bridge along the route had been studied for clearance and load limits. The articulated frame and 16 driving wheels demanded slow speeds and constant monitoring. Dispatchers across 3 states coordinated traffic, sometimes stopping trains for hours to allow the convoy to pass. Crowds gathered wherever the Big Boy paused. School children waved from fences as the locomotive rolled past for the first time in generations. Mechanics rode alongside, watching for hot bearings or signs of trouble. On open stretches, the diesel settled into a steady pull. their combined power barely enough to keep the massive engine moving. The journey focused on precision rather than speed. After nearly a week on the rails, 4014 crossed into Wyoming. The final approach to Cheyenne moved at a crawl as crews guided the locomotive through the steam shop gates. When the doors closed, the big boy had returned home. Inside the Cheyenne steam shop, restoration began with challenges that had troubled engineers for decades. Converting a firebox designed for coal to burn oil efficiently required careful engineering. An earlier attempt in 1946 with Big Boy 4005 had failed due to uneven heat distribution, and that experiment ended after 2 years. This time, engineers designed a new firepan from 3/8 inch plate steel, reinforced to withstand both heat and weight. A single venturi burner replaced the coal grates, allowing oil to flow by gravity from the tender and mix with steam before entering the firebox. Air tubes fed oxygen precisely where needed, while a massive refractory brick flash wall absorbed and spread heat evenly. The result produced a clean, consistent burn with minimal smoke. Modern requirements extended far beyond the firebox. Federal rules demanded positive train control on mainline locomotives, including those built before World War II. Engineers studied original drawings, then discreetly integrated microprocessors, antennas, and radios into the cab. The system monitored speed, location, and signals, capable of stopping the train automatically if safety limits were exceeded. Brake systems, wiring, and air compressors were rebuilt or adapted. When replacement parts could not be sourced, machinists fabricated them from scratch, matching dimensions to thousandths of an inch. For the first time, a big boy met 21st century safety standards. On May 4th, 2019, steam filled the air in Cheyenne. After 5 years of work, crews gathered along the rails as 4014 prepared to move under its own power for the first time in nearly 60 years. The boiler was hot, systems checked repeatedly, and the rebuilt firebox glowed with steady heat. In the cab, gauges and levers unchanged since the 1940s sat beside modern control screens. When the throttle opened, the exhaust barked, and the locomotive began to roll. 7,000 horsepower surged through the frame as the big boy emerged into the Wyoming sunlight. Cheers erupted across the yard. The machine once thought finished had returned. The true test arrived later on the main line in Nebraska. A freight train stretching 10,000 feet sat stalled on Blair Hill, a grade measuring just over 1%. One of the lead diesel locomotives had lost power, leaving the remaining units unable to move the heavy load. Traffic backed up and pressure mounted. Dispatchers weighed options while crews cycled breakers and checked systems. Somewhere along the line, someone noted that Big Boy 4014 was nearby, returning light from a public display in Omaha. Authorization followed quickly. The call went out to bring the steam locomotive to the scene. 4014 coupled onto the rear of the stranded train as steam poured from its valves. The crew tightened hoses and checked connections under watchful eyes across the division. When the signal came, pressure climbed past 200 pounds per square inch. The throttle opened and the massive driver slipped briefly before gripping the rails. The exhaust roared across the fields as power surged into the stalled cars. Inch by inch, the train began to move. For 20 minutes, the big boy pushed until nearly 2 miles of freight crested Blair Hill. A 78-year-old locomotive accomplished what modern diesels could not. Footage of the rescue spread quickly. Rail workers and enthusiasts watched as steam proved its strength on a modern railroad. News outlets requested rights to the video, eager to share the moment. For the crew, the experience carried deeper meaning. It confirmed that sound engineering can endure beyond trends and technology cycles. Steam power had once symbolized progress, then obsolescence, and now relevance once more. Big Boy 4014 stood as proof that some machines outlast the assumptions made about them. Thanks for tuning in, and we will catch you in the next one.